I don't think I really need to go through a full biography of our speaker because that's why you're here today. You know Joel Beinin and his work. But for the record, he's the Donald J. McLachlan Professor of History Emeritus at Stanford University. But I want to mention something that doesn't appear on his bio page, and that is the fact that I've been at the Peace and Justice Center for 35 years now. And the occupation of Palestine was in full bloom at that time. The first Intifada was underway at that time. And in those 35 years, we've seen the conflict simmer and boil over and rage in turn, back and forth. And we've probably done more events on this single issue over those 35 years than any other issue. And every time Joel Beinin has stepped forward, given us his time and his deep knowledge to help us out. And that's because he's not only an academic and one of the finest academics on this issue on the planet, he's also an activist who cares very much about the people in Israel and Palestine. Please welcome Joel Beinin.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for that generous introduction. As long as we're having nostalgic memories, there was a party here, I believe right in this spot, when I received tenure, which was also the same time as the first Palestinian Intifada and the freeing of Nelson Mandela from jail and the impending liberation of South Africa from apartheid. And I uncharacteristically was optimistic that we'd soon see a Palestinian state. Since then, I have been consistently pessimistic, which people sometimes get upset about, but then the most pessimistic person in the room to say anything about Israel-Palestine has never been wrong. So after October 7th, 2023, a lot of pundits said things like, this changes everything. And you will recall that that kind of comment was also made after 9/11, 2021, and 9/11, 2001, and everything didn't change. It became more difficult to travel in and out of this country and even in the country, especially if you are Muslim or person of color, and a lot of other intrusive activities of the national security state. But no, things basically did not change. And as happened after 9/11, efforts to explain why that happened, a spectacular attack of terror targeting civilians on American soil in mass numbers for the first time since the War of 1812, disastrous intelligence and security failures. Efforts to explain why that happened were called justifying terrorism. And that's very similar to what has been offered up as a response to efforts to explain October 7th, 2023. Why begin with 9/11 and the comparison? Because the most important thing that didn't change after 9/11 and didn't change since October 7th, 2023, is the American empire. The United States has remained for the last quarter century, as for decades before that, a powerful empire and the most powerful and intrusive external power in the Middle East. The military budget has skyrocketed, and the United States, then as now, is the primary backer of Israel. Israel is, along with Saudi Arabia, although they were in the doghouse for a while, the major regional prop for the U.S. empire in the Middle East. That fact has remained constant despite lots of other changes. So, as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia was in the doghouse after the murder of the dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. And during the 2020 presidential campaign, then candidate Biden promised to make Mohammed bin Salman a pariah for being the one responsible for that murder, but that didn't happen. Similarly, during the presidential campaign of 2020, President Biden tweeted that there should be no more blank checks for Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who was and remains responsible for massive human rights violations in Egypt. There are some 65,000 Egyptian political prisoners. People are routinely disappeared, tortured, held without trial for years on end. And that hasn't happened. Egypt continues to be the second largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid on balance over the course of several decades after Israel. And just recently, the administration has authorized a new weapons shipment to Egypt. So Biden's promises to make Saudi Arabia and Egypt and other Arab states, pariah states, was not upheld. And instead, before October 7th, the Biden administration's highest priority in the Middle East was focused on strengthening the Sunni anti-Iran axis and fully integrating it by expanding the Abraham Accords, which had been brokered by the Trump administration and entailed Bahraini and United Arab Emirates recognition of Israel and the peace agreement. The Biden administration was focused on integrating the Saudis into that arrangement and brokering a full Saudi-Israeli rapprochement, a peace treaty, and mutual recognition. And bizarrely, even after October 7th, despite the manifest unwillingness of the Netanyahu government's to offer anything that looks like a path to Palestinian statehood, which is a big roadblock for the Saudis, the Biden administration officially, that's their solution to this problem. So the Biden administration continues Trump administration policy of unrestrained support for the state of Israel, despite the legal codification of apartheid in Israel's 2018 Basic Law, Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, despite the fact that even before October 7th, in 2020, 2021, 2022, the first half of 23, each of those years set a new record high of Palestinian deaths in the West Bank at the hands of either the Israeli military or the army. The government that was established by Benjamin Netanyahu in December of 2022 includes openly fascist messianists, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, settlers fully supported by those two ministers in particular, carried out a pogrom in the northern West Bank village of Hawara in February of 2022. There were weekly demonstrations against a proposed judicial coup that would have gutted the independence of the judiciary in Israel. That went on for fully 9 months, every week, larger and larger demonstrations, some of them well over 100,000. And none of that, in the slightest, affected the Biden administration's full support for the state of Israel. Why? So first, but not necessarily first in the order of actual policy relevant priorities, is Biden's personal Zionism. He is a representative of the older generation of both Jewish and non-Jewish Democrats who see the state of Israel, which was established in 1948, so just a few years after World War II, and that is very relevant, as reparations for the Holocaust. People like Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, South Carolina Representative Jim Clyburn, former now disgraced and discredited New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez. They're all of that generation, basically my generation and a tad older. And it's important to remember that this kind of support for Israel is a specifically Democratic Party phenomenon. The Republican Party historically was much more critical of Israel because it was the party of the oil companies, and Aramco, the Arabian American oil company, was, until it was nationalized in the 1970s by the Saudis, the single largest US overseas investment anywhere in anything. And the Republican Party was close to the leadership of Aramco, both politically and culturally, because of connections, appropriate to mention here, to the evangelical wing of the Presbyterian Church. So I mention that because this is always a problem for people who see themselves as progressive, that support for Israel was in fact a cause of the liberal and liberal left in the United States historically. Obviously, that has been changing in recent years, but this is part of what entrenches Israel so deeply in the Democratic Party. Younger Democrats like Richie Torres or even Hakeem Jeffries, who's kind of in the middle generation in his 50s, have different reasons for being strongly supportive of Israel. For them, it's a little bit more about the Benjamins, perhaps. More central to the policy relevant matter, though, is Biden and his national security team, Blinken and National Security Council guy. Yes, my names fly out of my head instantaneously these days. They both have all three of them have a neo-Cold War stance towards Iran. So Soviet Union disappeared, then we had global terrorism, and now we have Iran. And we know this because Biden could have, in the early days of his presidency, reversed Trump's pullout from the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. He said he would do it, and he didn't. And the reason that he didn't is that he thought that he could get a better deal, a more punitive and restrictive deal that Iran would agree to. Iran, quite reasonably, I think, said, why don't you uphold what we already agreed to before we agree to anything new. The Biden administration declined to do that. And so now Iran is much closer to a nuclear weapon than it was when Biden became president, and certainly than it was when the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was in force. This is an issue on which Israel, under Netanyahu, who has been prime minister of Israel for all but 18 months since 2009, are both in agreement and not in agreement. Netanyahu has been trying to drag the United States into a war against Iran since he became prime minister for the second time in 2009. We saw that in the notorious 2015 address he gave to the joint session of Congress, invited by the Republicans, not the Democrats. Biden, on the other hand, and before him, Obama, and even Trump, we have to say, do not want a regional war. But it is Biden policy although it was not a policy, to keep the pressure on Iran ratcheted up high. And so, insofar as the United States sees Israel's retaliation against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, or Israel's retaliation against Hezbollah, even though the United States was not given advance notice about the pagers and walkie-talkies blowing up in Lebanon last week. Insofar as the Biden administration sees those Israeli actions as a battle in the front against Iran, they are totally 100% supportive. What the Biden administration would like to see Israel doing is targeting Iran's proxies as they are viewed in Washington. That's a little bit crude, a way of thinking of it, but that is the way Washington and Israel thinks of it. So Israel should target those proxies, kill as few civilians as possible in the process, and by doing so, prove that the Biden administration strategy, that is, of bringing Saudi Arabia more fully into this Sunni anti-Iran axis, proving that that strategy is a viable one. That strategy was recently challenged by China, brokering the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That doesn't mean that the Saudis and the Iranians are going to become good friends, but it is a blinking light, shining light on the fact that American influence in the Middle East is not going to remain preeminent forever. There is this thing called China in the world, and they have aspirations, and the United States isn't going to be able to suppress them indefinitely. There are also, of course, the pro-Israel donors to the Democratic Party. Nothing to match the amount of money that Sheldon, the late Sheldon, and Miriam Adelson have dumped on the Republican Party in the last 15 years or so. But nonetheless, we're talking about big bucks. Michael Bloomberg donated in the current election cycle $41 million to Democratic Party and to its affiliated PACs and super PACs. Reid Hoffman, local Palo Alto boy, internet entrepreneur, founder of LinkedIn, who actually tried to recruit people to mount a primary challenge to Rashida Tlaib in Detroit and failed, but he's dropped $31.5 million on the Democratic Party and its PAC. Deborah J. Simon, 13 million. Chaim Saban, who's the 232nd richest person in the United States, according to Forbes magazine, has spent only $2 million in the current election cycle, but he formerly was way at the top of the list because he was close to the Clintons, apparently not so much to the Bidens. Neil Bloom, real estate and casino magnate, and Chaim Saban, both major backers of the United Democracy Project, which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee super PAC. So Neil Bloom has dropped $1.6 million on them. AIPAC in its PAC, not super PAC, has spent $16 million on the Democrats, and J Street has spent $4 million. J Street is now becoming the new AIPAC. Their stance since October 7th has been pretty much utterly uncritical of the Democratic National Committee and the Biden administration more broadly. What else hasn't changed? So I said Biden's personal politics and the politics of that generation, the American empire, and the role of pro-Israel donors to the Democratic Party. They have not changed. What else hasn't changed? The occupation hasn't changed. Israel has been occupying the West Bank since 1967. The Oslo Accords divided up the West Bank, leaving Israel in full control of Area C, which comprises 61% of the West Bank. And especially in the recent years, not just the current Netanyahu administration, but going back a decade or more, there have been escalating expulsions and threatened expulsions of Palestinians from the South Hebron Hills, or Masafer Yatta, as it's called in Arabic, from the shepherding regions around Ma'ale Adumim, which is a large settlement just east of Jerusalem, from the Jordan Valley, which has essentially been closed to Palestinians who are not permanent residents of that area since 2009, and in East Jerusalem, which Israel in practice annexed already in June 1967. The neighborhoods of Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah have been particularly targeted. Another Israeli factor which has not changed, but which has deepened, is that the great majority of Jewish Israelis have become further and further committed towards the right. That includes open embrace of policies that, for example, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are about 20% of all Israeli citizens, should not have equal rights with Jewish Israelis. I mean, openly anti-democratic apartheid-like measures, typically in public opinion polls, when close to a majority or a slim majority of support of Jewish Israelis. And that is the case despite the fact that there were, for 9 months before October 7th, these weekly protests against the Netanyahu government because of its plan to gut the independence of the judiciary. In those demonstrations, if there were 1,000 people out there demonstrating in Tel Aviv Saturday night, maybe 5,000 of them on a good night would be raising slogans about the occupation, things like there's no democracy in occupation. The great majority of the demonstrators were actively opposed to raising slogans like that, and in the early months of demonstrations were literally beating up people who had posters and signs with demonstration slogans of that sort. And that remains the case also for the demonstrations that began a few months ago, demanding that the Netanyahu government act more forthrightly to negotiate a deal that would release the hostages that Hamas took on October 7th. There are, by most counts, about 100 Israelis still held hostage by Hamas, of which 60 or 65 may still be alive. And there is a very strong movement critical of the Netanyahu government, certainly critical of its conduct of the war. And the great majority of people participating in that movement do not mention the occupation at all, because doing that would marginalize them as leftists, and at the tactical political level, they're right. Talking about the occupation is not a winning topic in Israeli politics. On the Palestinian side, the most important thing that has not changed is Palestinian disunity. Hamas won what was, by all accounts, a free and fair democratic election for the Palestinian Legislative Council in January of 2006. They tried with Fatah was previously the largest Palestinian party in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Israel and the United States, and eventually also the European Union, refused that, and consequently, Hamas appointed its own government, and Fatah, encouraged by Israel and the United States, tried to carry out a coup against the Hamas-led government in June of 2007. The plot was uncovered, and Hamas preempted the coup, and that resulted in the situation that persists until today. State authority control. Beyond this arrangement, which Israel has great responsibility for putting into place, more broadly, if you look at the Palestinian activist groups in the diaspora, including in the Bay Area, they are not politically unified. There is not a single clear political program that would explain how Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs are going to somehow coexist on the land between the river and the sea on the basis of equality and dignity and justice. Those three words are not a political program. That's not sufficient, and that is often about as much as people are willing to say. I'm not going to put forward a political program. That's not my job. But people who intend to be living on that piece of land need to be thinking about that. And there isn't a great deal of evidence, even before October 7th, that people were doing so. What did change then? First, the attack by Hamas and its allies on October 7th broke an intolerable stalemate. Since 2007, Israel and Egypt imposed a siege on the Gaza Strip, controlling the entry and exit of everything. People, goods, water, electricity. Israel controls the airspace, the fishing area, the population register. And as a result of the siege, which involved literally calculating the number of calories per day the people of Gaza should consume so that they don't die of malnutrition, but are just on the edge of it. Because of those siege conditions, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development declared in 2017 that the Gaza Strip would become unlivable by 2020. 2020 came and went, and the Gaza Strip was indeed, by my standards at least, unlivable, and yet 2.3 million people were still living there. So that situation needed to change, and Hamas succeeded in breaking that stalemate. Second, the fighting on October 7th and October 8th was the first time since 1948 that fighting took place on Israel's soil. All of Israel's wars after 1948, 1956, 1967, invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the 1973 war with Egypt and Syria, all of them took place outside the borders, the internationally recognized borders of the state of Israel. And that was part of the reason that Israelis were shocked and traumatized by October 7th, in addition to the particular brutality of the attacks themselves and their wide range and the utter and total intelligence and security and first responder failure that happened. The shock, the fact of breaking the stalemate, the fact that the fighting took place inside the internationally recognized borders of Israel, the fact that no one, perhaps not even Hamas leaders, expected that the Hamas attack would be as successful as it was. All of that put the question of Palestine back on the international agenda. So all of those things changed. And because those things changed, there has been among progressive supporters of Palestinian rights a tendency to see what Hamas did on October 7th as unequivocally positive. I don't agree with that. If the fact that Hamas engaged in armed struggle is not in and of itself, my view, problematic. I'm not a pacifist, but killing and civilians and taking them hostages, torturing people, sexual violence that was committed, although we don't know the exact extent of sexual violence and the extent to which it was premeditated or not. All of those things cross a line in international law. So if we agree that international law is a reference point in adjudicating international conflict, then everybody has to be held to the same standard. It's not okay for Israel to kill Palestinian civilians, as they have been doing massively in the Gaza Strip since October 7th and in the West Bank as well, although much less attention has been paid to that. Nearly 700 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli military or settlers in the West Bank since October 7th, 2023. So if it is not okay for Israel to kill and torture and abuse Palestinian civilians, it is equally not okay for Palestinian resistance to do that to Israeli civilians. One of the best reactions, it came early on, critical reactions to October 7th that I've come across is from Matan Kaminer, whose name some of you may remember because he and his family lived in Palo Alto for 7 years in the 2000s, and he went back to Israel and then refused to be inducted into the Israeli army, went to jail for 2 years for that refusal. There was a campaign of support for him and 5 others who at the same time also refused to serve in the Israeli army and went to jail with Matan for that. So this is what Matan had to say about October 7th. I think the global left, and the Palestine Solidarity Movement in particular, still has to come to terms with what took place on October 7th. The violence which Israel has exercised since then, though immensely intensified, is essentially similar to the kind of violence it has meted out against the Palestinians for decades. This is the psychopathically instrumental rationality analyzed by the Frankfurt School. Like me, he's an academic now, teaches at Queen's University in London. So Frankfurt School, we'll talk about that later if people want to ask questions. Justified by the claim that any other path would have caused the loss of more lives or of lives that matter. But October 7th was, to my mind, something quite new. It was a complicated and confusing combination of 3 things. 1, a stunning, imaginative military upset undertaken by an obvious underdog against a hubristic Goliath, a strategically understandable, if morally reprehensible, hostage-taking campaign, and a monstrous outbreak of sadistic, pogromistic violence, which took the lives of hundreds of defenseless civilians, including babies and old people, and included the desecration of corpses, sexual violence, and other obscenities. It is not precisely the same as the anti-colonial violence of the 20th century, which was analyzed so trenchantly by Frantz Fanon. there is something unprecedented about it, and it will take time to catch up intellectually. And I have some thoughts about that. I did actually write an essay about Frantz Fanon and Palestinian solidarity. So ask questions about that if you're inclined, or skip it if you're not. The more nuanced approach to national liberation wars of previous generations on the left has been replaced in some quarters by a simplistic Manichaeanism, such that any criticism of Hamas is considered tantamount to support for Israel. According to the people espousing this stance, this is what decolonization looks like. So if you have any problem with it, you must be against decolonization. This binarism should be familiar to Eastern European leftists. He's speaking to the journal Left East, which is why that's here, who have been told repeatedly that any criticism of elements of Ukraine's war effort is equivalent to support for the Russian invasion. Sophisticated writers have rejected this logic, and it is possible to do the same with regard to Hamas. It in no way detracts from the justice of the Palestinian cause. In fact, it strengthens it when that cause is carefully distanced from atrocities committed in its name. So why then has so much of the Palestine solidarity movement since October 7th missed the mark in this respect? I think the reason is, first and foremost, the broad decline of the left. We used to stand up and not be afraid to say that we were left, maybe even radical left, some people even revolutionary left. Those are not terms in American and even in international politics these days. We're progressives, whatever that means. Sounds less threatening, right? And what that also means is a certain political mushiness. So instead of things being defined in terms of principles of left internationalism or something, whatever you might want to call it, we are allies of communities defined by their identity. And if you are an ally, you don't criticize the community that you are aligned with, because that wouldn't be being a good ally. So there's a whole language and reconceptualization of politics that has taken place broadly, certainly not simply since October 7th, but it's been introjected into the amazing movement of Palestine solidarity that has emerged since October 7th. Such that saying that Hamas committed crimes on October 7th is seen as, at a minimum, soft Zionism and perhaps even actual sympathy for the state of Israel. The inability of the Palestinian political leadership to be clear about what they want contributes to this, because we can't criticize, and we don't even know exactly what it is we're being asked to support, since what does it mean, Free Palestine? I mean, yes, Palestine should be decolonized. Israel should abandon its program of Jewish supremacy from the river and the sea. I mean, none of that, I think, is controversial in an audience like this. But what is there actually going to be when Palestine is free? There's not been a whole lot of discussion about that. And part of this is connected to the way in which, for the good, I would say, but not unproblematically, elements of the left have entered the Democratic Party. So we now have a couple dozen Democrats in Congress who will stand up and say we should have an arms embargo on Israel, or at minimum, there should be some restrictions on arms shipments to Israel because of their human rights violations. And Bernie Sanders just gave a good speech on this So all of that is good. This represents a humongous advance in the kinds of things that it's possible to say in the respectable political arena, and therefore also on the mass media and even national public radio, even occasionally. But it means you have to play the game. So, as we all know, there was not a Palestinian speaker permitted to speak on the main stage of the Democratic National Convention, even though one of the speakers proposed, Ruha Rahman, released the speech that she proposed to give, which was totally vanilla. I mean, she was certainly not supporting Hamas, not supporting armed struggle. She avoided any term that could arouse sharp opposition, but even that was too much for Kamala Harris. Nonetheless, both J Street, the liberal Zionist NGO campaign group, and the Arab American Institute said that the Democratic National Convention was a great advance for Palestinian rights. So we need to be arguing about, well, okay, if we're playing the game in the Democratic Party, and that's as much as you get in the Democratic Party, and it is, of course, an advance. There was, for the first time, a panel that was officially sponsored by the party to talk about the question of Palestine on the main stage, with several hundred people attended and so on. But Jim Zogby, the head of the Arab American Institute, said there has not been an Arab American speaker on the main stage of the Democratic Party since he nominated Jesse Jackson in 1986, I think it was. So our, even though there's this sharp contradiction between this utterly unprecedented and unanticipated movement of Palestine solidarity that has emerged all across this country and internationally, first and foremost, but certainly not only on college campuses, and a certain change in political discourse, which, however, has not in the slightest changed the relations of power that govern continued unrestrained total American support for Israel, which I think it is fair to say will continue regardless of who wins the election in November, and whatever that election ends us up with in the way of a political scene in this country. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions and comments.
Thank you, Joel. For the question and answer, just hold your hands up and I will come to you with the microphone. For those of you who are watching on Zoom, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. And if I can read them outside, I will ask the Zoom questions myself. So I think first hand here.
First outside Zoom event I have been involved. Very curious how that was.
Hello, I'm Sandra Drake. Hi, Joel. It's good to see you back. I have two questions. If you don't want to take the time for both, probably the most important one is what your thoughts are on what, if anything, can be done to budge the U.S. position towards Israel's extremism. The second one is I'm curious to know what you wrote about the revolutionary movements in general.
Yeah, of course, the academics want to know about that. So more of the same is the answer to the first question, what can be done to budge U.S. policy. We need, first of all, to understand that political change in this country does not begin in Washington, D.C. Any real change is always bottom up. If we go back to, for example, the civil rights movement, the legislation that was enacted in 1963 and 1965 came at the tail end of a movement that began in the late 1940s, primarily in the South, primarily led by African American people. Then white people of conscience joined in. And so any change of that magnitude has to begin with popular mobilization. Now, Palestine, as I'm sure most of you know, has always been an exception. Progressive except Palestine, that's a category which is increasingly less acceptable on the left, but still exists. And for that reason, it was much more difficult to organize around Palestinian rights than almost any other comparable question. That has changed since October 7th. So very unexpectedly, I can't offer you a logical reason for why there was this enormous outburst of support for Palestinian rights after October 7th. But what's happened is that Palestine has now become a symbol for all kinds of opposition to hierarchy and oppression. So if you are a supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement, or if you are a supporter of the Me Too movement, or if you support LGBTQ rights, or whatever issue you may have been engaged in before October 7th, that has now become linked to the question of Palestine. And even in the Jewish community, which has sharply split on generational lines. So in Portland, a group of under 30-ish something folks who call themselves queer anti-Zionist Jews. And these are the children of the leaders of the institutional Jewish community, whose parents literally can't acknowledge, in some cases, even their existence, but more commonly, the fact that their views are normative among younger members of the Jewish community and younger members of the non-Jewish community as well, of course. So more, and I don't have a clear strategy. What I wrote about Fanon was basically a review of a recent biography of Fanon by Adam Schatz, an expanded review essay. Adam Schatz argued that on the one hand, Fanon is of course widely known as justified violence in the movement of decolonization, and particularly Algeria. He was the Western-facing ideologue of the Algerian National Liberation Front and the Algerian struggle. If you've watched Battle of Algiers, and if you haven't watched it, you should. You know that assaults on French civilian settlers in Algiers were at one point a central tactic of the movement. And what Schatz points out in his book is that people typically quote from the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon's best known book, in which he talks about the cathartic effects of anti-colonial violence. And they usually don't mention the third chapter of the book, which is a series of psychiatric case studies. He was by profession a psychiatrist, and he treated Algerians, French settlers, and French military people in his clinic, and they all suffered from PTSD as a result of the colonial and the anti-colonial violence that they participated in, which is to say that however the situation in Israel, Palestine ends, we are going to be having generations of Palestinians and Israelis who are going to be deeply damaged by the violence that Israel has visited on the Palestinian people, not since October 7th, not since June 1967, not even since 1948, when the State of Israel was established and 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes and their lands, but going all the way back to earlier stages of the Zionist settlement project. However and whenever Palestine is decolonized, is only the beginning of the next phase in that story. And if you remember, if you have seen Battle of Algiers, and if you remember the scene where Ben Mehidi is speaking to the former juvenile delinquent turned hero of the anti-colonial struggle, Ali Lapointe, and he says, you can't win a war or a revolution by terrorism. Terrorism can start a process, but eventually the people have to act. And it's hard to start a war or a revolution. It's hard to win a revolution, but it's only after we win that the real work begins. And that's what I was referring to when I was saying that the Palestinian leadership hasn't offered us even yet a program to line out the parameters of that post-colonial work.
Next question is back here.
Hi. Both you and Natan Kaminer briefly mentioned sexual violence on October 7th. Do you know of hard evidence to support that assertion? Because I think most of the investigative reporting since then has shown that there isn't any hard evidence to support that. And that's one reason, say, the New York Times had to walk back their December 2023 article.
So they actually didn't walk it back, although they should have. They didn't put it on their podcast. So the hard evidence, there is no hard evidence to support Israel's initial claims that the Hamas leadership ordered mass rape as a strategy or tactic on October 7th. That's not true, or at least there's no evidence to support that claim. There were several specific instances that appeared in that New York Times article and more even in Israeli media, which also turned out on further investigation to be unsupportable. The Israeli Women's Rights Organization, which originally came out supporting some, not all, of Israel's claims, recanted its original statement, but said, we do have evidence that acts of sexual violence were committed on October 7th. In fact, it would be pretty bizarre and unusual if there were no acts of sexual violence committed on October 7th, because one of the most constant aspects of warfare is that it does entail sexual violence. War is a gendered activity like most other social activities. So I would recommend M. Gessen's latest article in the New Yorker, in which is entitled, "What Do We Know About sexual violence on October 7th. I think that's the title. It's close enough so that you'll be able to find it if you want. And they say that there was sexual violence. We do not know whether or not it was authorized by the Hamas military command. We do not know the extent of it, but there was sexual violence. And I think that's a pretty reasonable conclusion at this point. There have been no reported pregnancies, but that would be very, very unlikely in any circumstance like this. And much of the evidence, either way, has been destroyed because places were burned to the ground, because the people who were the first responders didn't have proper training, and they were more interested in cleaning up the mess than preserving forensic evidence and so on. So what we can and should reject the early claims of Israel that this was something particularly heinous, that Hamas, because it is simply an inhuman organization, planned to do this. If I had to speculate, which I don't like to do, but okay, I think that's required in this instance. What I'd suggest is that the first waves of people who crossed the boundary between the Gaza Strip and Israel were the elite Hamas units who probably did not engage in sexual violence because they were too busy focused on their military objectives. But after them came all sorts of civilians and others who may or may not have been Hamas members or supporters, but who were participating in a prison breakout. And if you think about prison rebellions like Attica, that's a scene in which all sorts of crimes can be committed, which can be explained, but I think not justified by the circumstances of the incarceration.
Before we go to our next question, I want to address our Zoom listeners and viewers. I am having trouble getting the Q&A box up on my little tablet, so I haven't been able to get to your questions yet, but I'll keep working on it. So don't give up on us, but for now, I apologize.
My name is George Marks, and I live in Richmond, California. I'm sorry. My name is George Marks. I live in Richmond, California, and I've admired you for a long time, and I will admire you regardless of what you say in response to what I'm saying.
Thank you.
But I'm really troubled by some of what you're saying, and I would love to get a response. For me, what I see a lot is propaganda from the Israeli side and the US side. And literally and figuratively, anytime there is a single target, they're assassinated or imprisoned in some cases. And I heard Rashid Khalidi say, interviewed by Peter Beiner, that he thought that those who could best speak for the Palestinians, that there is no unity among the Palestinian people, and that what could be best speak for them would be a group of political prisoners who are jailed being able to talk together. And I've heard others, but I've also been in, I don't know, probably 125 protests since October 7th and listened to a lot of people. I've heard one person say anything. I'm Jewish as you are. I've heard one anti-Semitic statement in all that time. I've heard a lot of talk about fear of anti-Semitism in the United States. And I've seen a lot of unity in a lot of spaces. And coalition building, has it been effective at changing things? No. One of the things that I really noticed is, for example, Richmond, where I live, is the first place in the United States to call for a ceasefire. Berkeley, where there's plenty of privilege, along with not everybody there is, Berkeley is privileged, has not passed anything at all. That's no accident.
No, that's not.
San Francisco State University, the encampment was tied between the faculty and some of the faculty and students who were not, and the faculty were not just Palestinian students. I don't understand how you expect there to be a single unified answer. I listen to Christians, I listen to Jews, I listen to Muslims. I think there has to be a consensus. There's so much pressure, and I don't see how there can be unity without it being torn to shreds, whatever the answer is. 2-state, 1-state, whatever.
So I don't think we disagree very much based on what you said. What I'm thinking of is the comparison between the Palestine Liberation Organization and the African National Congress. The African National Congress, in large part because it was very heavily influenced by the South African Communist Party, Stalinist communist parties, we all have our criticisms, but they promoted a universalist perspective, which translated into a program for a free South Africa that entailed one person, one vote, non-racialism. And of course, with an 80% Black majority, South Africa was going to be a Black-led country and so forth. And the end of apartheid in South Africa did not resolve many of the political issues that people hoped they would, although I think we have to agree that the achievement was nonetheless worth a great deal. And that's what I mean is missing from the Palestinian political scene. Now, of course, there wasn't total unity around the African leadership of the African National Congress in South Africa. There was the Azanian People's Liberation Front. There was the Inkatha Zulu movement. But locally and internationally, they were the leading force and supporting the movement against apartheid in South Africa. More or less meant you were supporting the program of the African National Congress, the Freedom Charter. We don't have anything like, I mean, people are not going to support the Hamas Charter, for God's sake, or even the updated 2017 Hamas Declaration of Political Principles. That just can't happen. That's not a broadly acceptable universalist political statement that will be embraced, not even by all Palestinians, let alone internationally. So that's what I mean, and I don't mean anything like everybody has to line up 100% behind a particular thing. And I totally agree with Rashid Khalid. He and I have, I think, never significantly disagreed on this question. As Palestinian politics is today structured, the most likely group to emerge as consensual leaders are the political prisoners. That's been the case for quite a long time. And for that reason, Israel represses them quite harshly. So yes, in this country in particular, maybe Germany also in particular, supporters of Palestinian rights have faced, especially since October 7th, but well before that as well, an enormous wave of repression that is reminiscent of McCarthyism in the 1950s. And that is precisely because, well, it's for two reasons. First, it's because supporters of Israel are still very deeply and strongly entrenched in the American political system, in American institutions like universities, in American mediascape, and so on. But it's also because of what I said before, that support for Palestinian rights has become a symbol and a unifying cause for people who are coming from all sorts of different movements. Support for Black liberation, gay liberation, women's movements, and so forth. And so Peter Beinart said, what is it about the claim that Zionism is a settler colonial movement, which of course the Zionist leaders of the early 20th century openly said that that's what they were, because that was completely acceptable in the Eurocentric world of that era. What is it about that claim that arouses such ire? Well, the United States was established by a settler colonial movement. So if there's a problem with the Zionist project and the state of Israel being the outcome of settler colonialism, maybe we have a problem here too that we haven't attended to. And if Israelis have to pay reparations and make amends and deal with the Palestinians that they have exiled and expropriated, oh, maybe we have to do that too. And of course, that is a total freak out for the vast majority of the American people, and we aren't. Those issues are not on the political agenda in the United States. But because of the close relationship of between the United States and Israel, if the Palestine Solidarity Movement is pushing that question onto the agenda with relation to Israel, well, then we Americans, it's almost automatic that we. Oh, yeah, we have to think about that too.
I'll go right here.
Yeah, one of the Zoom attendees spotted me on camera and texted me her question.
Very good. Now we're talking about advanced technology.
Let's put out Bob's phone number to everybody.
Okay, no, I just lost it. Okay, I think I remember. How are Palestinians in Gaza supposed to defend themselves?
That's a question which seems like it has an answer, but it doesn't. So if we're talking about defending the lives of Palestinians in Gaza, so of course, Israel is first and foremost responsible for the life of every single Palestinian they have killed in Gaza since October 7th, and also for the lives of the people who died of malnutrition or preventable diseases, or were not allowed to cross the border to seek medical care, and all the things that happened in the 16 years of the siege since 2007. But if you're a political organization that claims to be taking responsibility for the liberation of your people, and you undertake an attack on Israel in the style that Hamas did on October 7th, then you ought to be able to anticipate that there will be an Israeli response. And Hamas, we don't really know exactly what the Hamas leadership was thinking in that respect. But we can certainly ask at this point, was it worth it? And I would say no. The Gaza Strip has been destroyed. It will not be inhabitable in the foreseeable future, no matter how many people end up alive there. Every single institution has been, at a minimum, gravely damaged and in many cases utterly and totally destroyed. Schools, mosques, churches, libraries, museums, archives, hospitals, everything that a society needs. I mean, that is essentially textbook definition of genocide, over and above the actual killing of people. So one can't really argue that what Hamas did on October 7th constitutes defending the people of the Gaza Strip. It was an expression of anger and outrage and frustration, totally understandable, but politically pointless.
Thank you. It was a brilliant solution, whoever came up with that. So if you want, if you're watching on Zoom, okay, just a sec. Go ahead and send a text to the Peace Center's phone number, 650-326-8837. That's 650-326-8837, and we'll try to get your questions on. And Bob, you wanted to announce about the weekly vigils and this follow-up.
Yeah, I think you sort of answered it, but she's texted me a clarification. I mean, Hamas is the official government of Gaza, fairly and squarely, elected by the people. So if the Palestinians want to have Hamas to represent them, who are we to say that's not acceptable?
Oh, nothing that I said has anything to do with Hamas having won an election. On the other hand, the last time any election happened among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza was January 2006. That was a while ago. And Hamas was actually doing pretty poorly in public opinion polls before October 7th. Their standing shot up quite sharply, more so in the West Bank than in the Gaza Strip, because the West Bank is not suffering what the people of the Gaza Strip are suffering after October 7th, although they are suffering plenty in their own right. Yeah, Hamas won a free and fair election, fair and square. I don't have any problem about that. Israel should have taken the hints that were dropped that Hamas was actually open to negotiating with Israel. It didn't. It should have. I don't have any problem with that. And there were elections scheduled for the West Bank, not the Gaza Strip, in May of 2021, and they were canceled by the Palestinian Authority with the support of Israel because the Palestinian Authority thought that it's the faction of Fatah that it favored wasn't going to win those elections. So the state of electoral democracy among the Palestinians leaves a great deal to be desired.
Over here, we have a quick announcement.
Hi, my name's Michelle. Sorry to interrupt with an announcement. I'm part of Vigil for Gaza, which is a Palo Alto-based grassroots group, and we have a vigil every Sunday night at the top corner of Town and Country from 5:30 till 7. I'm a Vigil for Gaza. We're on Instagram as Vigil4 Gaza. If you want to follow us, a lot of people are here from the group. And next Saturday at King Plaza on the 28th, we're having a fundraiser for Heal Palestine. With the executive director will be there. And it's a cultural festival, a celebration of Palestinian resistance, and we are raising money for the important work that Heal Palestine does. So thank you.
So I want to say, when I checked in with some of my colleagues earlier in the week, we just arrived from Portland last Sunday, but when I checked in on Monday and Tuesday with colleagues, they were very aware of the vigil and pointed it out to me as one of the very positive things that has happened in Palo Alto since October 7th.
So I have gotten a text question from a Zoom viewer, Wayne, and I feel morally obligated to go to this next. What will it take for the U.S. to stop sending bombs and weapons to Israel?
Well, we already talked about that a little bit, and the best answer I can give you is more of the same of what we have been doing since October 7th and even before October 7th. We did, before the squad was elected, we had nobody in Congress who would speak in favor of Palestinian rights. Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar in particular have been absolutely heroic in standing up in face of the most vicious racist attacks that have been directed against them because they are two Muslim women. They have been absolutely exceptional, and they have been joined by others. Okay, Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman were defeated. Can't win all the time, but that still leaves lots of people in Congress, nowhere close to even a majority in the Democratic caucus, but way more than there were. Bernie Sanders, if people remember the 2014 Israeli assault on Gaza, was totally supportive of Israel at that point. And it was a great deal in the ensuing 10 years. It's unfortunate that it took him 10 years, but okay, better late than never. The best time to support a ceasefire is now, even though yesterday would have been better. So there is this contradiction that on the one hand, we can see real, palpable political change. On the other hand, we do not have anything close to the level of power that we need to actually affect a substantial change in policy.
Could you comment on your views that what we're seeing is a geopolitical mega battle for post-World War II definition of the world order, and that Netanyahu is trying to draw us being the United States, into a larger war by going at what he's doing in Lebanon, with the hopes that it will end up in a larger mega battle, which would bring in the Soviet Union, which would bring in China, and which would blow up the whole Middle East in a way that he hopes he would end up standing.
So, first of all, it's not my view that the question of Palestine is, by definition, a part of a global struggle. It is Netanyahu's view that Iran is the principal factor responsible for everything bad that Israel is confronting. That is totally consistent with every Israeli leader's understanding of things going back to 1948, which is to say, the Zionist movement and the state of Israel subsequently was always highly reluctant to acknowledge that who they were confronting were the people of Palestine. Because if the enemy is the people of Palestine, well, then, as Moshe Dayan once said, we came here and took their land and are now living on it. And then what do we do? So much easier to think, oh, it's Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, it's the Arab states, it's the global Muslim terrorist movement, it's Iran, it's somebody that's not the people of Palestine. So we should first and foremost resist that framing of the question. The question is the Zionist movement's colonization of Palestine and the need for a deep and broad process of decolonization to take place so that the two peoples who live between the river and the sea can live there in peace, security, with justice and dignity. Biden both does and does not, as I said, accept Netanyahu's framing of this issue in these broader global terms. Biden does see Iran as the principal American adversary in the Middle East. I think that is deeply mistaken. The Iranian regime has on many different occasions, first and foremost, the signing of the nuclear deal, which President Trump axed, indicated that it is prepared for some kind of more normal diplomatic relationship with, first and foremost, its Sunni Arab neighbors, and secondly, with the United States. But the American political class, for the most part, is still obsessed by the American hostage crisis with Iran in 1979 and 1980. I mean, that was pumped up as something that would traumatize the American people, and did traumatize the American people, and lay the basis for a whole fabric of lies and misrepresentation about what happened in Iran, both before the 1979 revolution, during the revolution, and since. And the United States has simply played that card wrongly from day one, because we could not get over the fact that a local movement overthrew the Shah, who had been installed by a CIA MI6 coup in 1953, and people shouldn't be allowed to do that to the United States. But people are increasingly not accepting American hegemony, not in the Middle East and beyond. I mean, it's going to be a long, complicated story for how that ends. But the Republican Party and a good chunk of the Democratic leadership is still wedded to the notion that, as President Bush the Elder said, what we say goes. This question is over here.
Hello, you referred to Hamas sexual violence and the violence against the corpses and torture, but all of these represent Israeli tactics that have been used against Palestinians for decades. And investigative journalists like at The Intercept have shown that there is no credible evidence for such claims of mass rape. There's one case of an Israeli woman being raped in a tunnel by a Hamas agents, but that's the only one that has credible evidence. And so my question is, what do you have to say about how these accusations against Palestinians are actually being crimes that are being committed by the Israelis, and the Hannibal Directive, which most people don't even know about, how that was used on October 7th against civilians, Israeli civilians. Thank you.
So I think we need practice in learning that two things can be true at the same time. So first, it's true that the Israeli propaganda machine, the Hasbara machine in Hebrew, used claims of sexual violence, of children beheaded in ovens. President Biden even mentioned that he had seen a picture of that on 60 Minutes. The picture doesn't exist. So all sorts of fabrications were mobilized by the Israeli propaganda machine and were accepted as fact by both leading American political figures and the American media. CNN was almost as guilty as Fox News in this respect. So we should, of course, totally reject the Israeli propaganda claims. And it's also true that Israel has tortured and raped Palestinian detainees, not just since October 7th. It goes back many decades. Those facts don't tell us anything at all about what Hamas and its supporters did or didn't do on October 7th. They're just those two stories are not factually connected to each other. So yes, there is the one case of the woman who claimed that she was raped in a tunnel, which is, as far as I know, the only instance in which a named person has come forward and said, "This happened to me." So under those circumstances, of course, we believe them. But there are other instances where the evidence is less clear. The Intercept story did not say that there was no sexual violence. It said that Israel's claim that there was orchestrated sexual violence as an explicit tactic ordered from above, there's no evidence for that. And I agree, there is no evidence for that, which is very different from there was no sexual violence on October 7th. So the world doesn't exist in black and white. That the Israelis do all those horrible things. The Israelis do plenty of horrible things. I mean, I'm not trying to in any way raise a question mark about that. The Israelis do a whole bunch of horrible things. Yes, they do, and they've been doing it for a long time. And for the most part, those things are not noticed by the Western media, and Israel gets away with it. And even when they are noticed by the Western media, I mean, the rape of the Palestinian detainee in the state Beinin detention camp in Israel was on the front page of the New York Times. But nobody concluded from that, as they might have, that this has been a general practice of what Israeli military people and security people do to Palestinian detainees and have done for a very long time. So when it is discovered that Israel has committed these kinds of sharp, individually focused, grave violations of human rights, sometimes these days it gets through. 20, 30 years ago, it wouldn't have gotten through at all. But the Western media is slow to come to the conclusion. The exact opposite happens in the case of Hamas. The worst thing that is said about them is immediately assumed to be true and generalizable. And then we have to spend months saying, no, not this and not that, but that. But the project of sorting out what did and didn't exactly happen in those two spheres are separate. They logically have nothing to do with each other. So we need to train ourselves to say Israel did and didn't do these things, Hamas did and didn't do those things. And that's how we should approach it, rather than, oh, Israel did that, so we therefore don't talk about what Hamas did.
Joel,
there's no question at this point. An Israeli officer ordered an Israeli tank to fire on a home in a kibbutz in which Israeli civilians were being held captive by a Hamas fighter. And I think 2 people were killed as a result. There's no, I mean, that's been reported even in the Israeli press, black and white in that way.
Joel, let me just check in. It's 3:30. How are you doing on time? And
I'm fine. I have energy as long as you do.
okay. Next question is over here.
You, during your talk, you seem to imply that there's a segment of the Palestinian solidarity movement that we're seeing everywhere that has been either condoning or supporting the Hamas's atrocities. And as someone who has been part of Vigil for Gaza and is now, in this, I haven't seen any of that. In fact, what I usually see is a lot of condemnation of violence against any civilian, and a lot of trying to commiserate with the Jewish community that we are neighbors with. So I'm curious to what extent or where you're seeing, since I haven't really seen that.
So I wouldn't expect you would see it that much on the peninsula. Palo Alto, we're like cool people and neighborly, and everybody's liberalish, and there hadn't been any big history of anti-Semitism in Palo Alto or surrounding areas recently. So I'm not surprised that you say you haven't seen it. But it's surely support for Hamas. Respected university professors like Andreas Malm writing in the blog of Verso Books, or Jody Dean writing in the blog of Verso Books, or Palestinian, I think it's a lecturer at Birzeit University, Abdul Jawad Omar, writing in Mondoweiss. Even to a certain extent, people like Tarek Bakoni, who's written an outstanding book on Hamas, Hamas Contained, one of the best recent books about Hamas, have actually expressed unrestrained support for Hamas, straight out. Support Hamas is the leader of the Palestinian resistance. The left should support Hamas, just like that. Now, no, you don't hear that in the vigil at Town and Country. I wouldn't expect, but it's out there, and it's not. It's not something that has been said accidentally and without thought. The things I just referenced, we're talking about long, detailed articles that make those arguments, or more commonly, chants that I don't think were raised at Stanford, at least I haven't heard of it, but were raised at some East Coast institutions. Settlers go home, Palestine is ours alone. We don't want two states, we want all of 48. So those are statements which send shivers into the Jewish community. I don't think they're exactly anti-Semitic. They skate on the edge of it, but they certainly don't have the perspective that at the end of the day, there are 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians who live between the river and the sea, and neither one of those communities is going anywhere. And so the political project of the left ought to be, how are they going to continue to live there with more security, in peace, with justice and equality and dignity for everyone? Can you see why settlers go home, Palestine is ours alone doesn't get to that? So people shouldn't chant things like that.
Okay, we have another question from a Zoom viewer, from Gregory. If Hamas and Israel somehow manage to agree, my phone just went blank, somehow manage to agree on some plan, the radical wing of Hamas will promptly split off from Hamas, just as the radical wing of the PLO split off from the PLO, and the PLO participated in an actual peace process. Please comment.
That could happen. Hamas and Israel aren't going to agree to anything in the foreseeable future, so we won't need to worry about that. I am not offering you here a plan for how this problem is going to be resolved. I don't know. I can offer you principles that I think should govern the resolution of the problem,
There will have to be full equality for the Palestinian citizens of Israel. There will have to be a broad decolonization of everything between the river and the sea. Radical changes in almost everything about the way Israeli society is structured. Israel will have to recognize the right of Palestinian refugees to return. It will have to offer compensation for their property and reparations, and there will have to be restorative justice. And all of it, all the settlements are going to have to either be removed or completely reconfigured so that they're no longer apartheid institutions that are solely Jewish. So all of that is enormous and will take decades, if not generations, to accomplish once people are at the point of being willing to do it, which people are not at this point willing to do it. And I don't know how they will get there.
Okay, next question is here.
Yep, this is a real question, not a Zoom question.
The Zoom questions are real.
So going back to we have to go beyond free Palestine. When you were talking, I understood you said you were including the left in that, the new left or whatever you said. But we cannot create that ANC thing. That has to come from the Palestinians.
Absolutely.
So what should we be doing besides trying to educate people, this is genocide, this is apartheid, we need to stop the embargo? What, if you're saying that's not enough, what should we be doing while we wait for the ANC?
That is all that we can do. And we should do more of it. We should not be offering to the Palestinian people a program for their liberation. They are going to have to come up with that on their own. And when they do, if it meets reasonable criteria, we should stand up and support it. I mean, that's the way such things have historically worked. And if and when they do, there will be things done that we won't be happy with. People who supported the right of the Algerian people to independence and self-determination had to hold their breath or avert their eyes from some pretty gruesome things that were done to accomplish that. Now, today, some people are looking at that and saying, oh, that's decolonization and therefore that's good, so Hamas is cool too. But Algeria is still paying the price for the extraordinary level of violence, first and foremost, that the French imposed on Algeria after they invaded the country in 1830 and occupied it for the next 132 years, but also in the struggle for independence and in the counterinsurgency and the tortures and brutalizations that the French imposed, which then exploded post-independence when tens of thousands of Algerians killed each other during the first summer of their independence because people were accused of being collaborators. And then in the 1990s, maybe 1 million Algerians were killed in the internecine war between the Islamists and the secularists. So all of that violence is rooted in the colonial period. So we ought not to idealize the violent excesses that will inevitably be part of any kind of movement for decolonization.
We're going to go with one more question, and because Hilton is here and I know he's got a quality question to end up on.
Hi, Hilton Openzinger. Well, actually two. One. Well, one is an observation and for you to comment on. You said, has everything changed since October 7th? And I think nothing has changed in some respects since 1948. That all of what's going on is a extension of Israeli policies to destroy the Palestinian people as a people. In fact, maybe even kill most of what's going on in Gaza now. So that this is a continuation that will end up with, no Palestinian state, no democratic state, only a Jewish state, which was their intention originally. Okay, so that's something to observe. Another one is, it seems that Trump is Netanyahu's candidate. That there's constant interjection in U.S. politics, such as Netanyahu speaking to Congress, even before, of course, speaking about Iran, and that. Well, I anticipate there's going to be some kind of October surprise, and maybe it will be the full-scale war. But what is it that Trump offers to Israel, to Netanyahu, that Biden doesn't? What is it that's drawing Netanyahu so closely with Trump?
So the answer to the second point that you raised also has ramifications for the first. So under Trump, what we saw is literally individuals who had personally contributed substantial amounts of money to some of the most radical and violent settler projects in the West Bank being in the White House. We're talking about Friedman, the ambassador, the US ambassador to Israel. We're talking about Jared Kushner and his family. I mean, they literally supported extremist yeshivot, religious seminaries in the West Bank, where rabbis were teaching that the souls of Palestinians were not equal to the souls of Israelis, and they could be killed because they're going to grow up and be terrorists. And I mean, real crazy stuff. And that kind of violent messianism has exploded in Israel since October 7th, although it had been cultivated for many years before in some of the more extreme settlements. So Netanyahu prefers Trump because there were no limits. Biden totally supports Israel, but his vision of the Israel that he supports is not the Israel that actually exists. And that's the reason that at first, for weeks, maybe even months, Biden was saying, oh, Israel is abiding by international law in the way it's carrying out this war. And I mean, that wasn't true from the first minute, because the Israeli political and military leadership openly proclaimed its genocidal intentions from day one. The Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, said, we're cutting the water and the food and the fuel, and there will be complete siege on Gaza, no medical equipment, nothing. We're fighting human animals. And Biden hears, or maybe didn't hear that, and says, yeah, they're abiding by international law, after they literally proclaimed the conditions of genocide. I mean, that's the legal definition of genocide, what the Minister of Defense said. And if we want to get it into the religious sphere, which again is increasingly important in Israel, Netanyahu himself twice gave speeches in which he quotes from the Hebrew Bible, the commandment, remember what Amalek did to you. And that is, again, a prescription for genocide, because the commandment is kill every single man, woman, and child, and every animal, their donkeys and their sheep and their goats and their camels. And King Saul, who actually did make war on the Amalekites, spared the life of the Amalekite king, and for that reason he was punished and wasn't allowed to become the founder of the kingly dynasty that ruled the ancient Israelites, and that honor was given to David. So on the one hand, the Israelis proclaimed their genocidal intentions as clear as could possibly be, and Biden simply didn't hear it, didn't see it.
and in fact concocted pictures of beheaded children that he saw that he didn't see because the pictures don't exist. So Biden has his image of Israel. He would like an Israel that, okay, they could kill a lot of Palestinians and whatever, but I don't talk about it like that, for God's sake. It's not necessary to do that. You could do it without. So, and that's the Israel that Chuck Schumer supports. Chuck Schumer gave a big speech against Netanyahu, right? Never voted not to give a weapon to Israel, but gave a big speech. So there's the centrists of the Democratic Party want to totally support an Israel that is not guided by violent messianic fascists, as has been the case in the current government of Israel in particular, although that current of thinking has, as I said, been cultivated for some years before. The same way that Trump did not drop out of the sky onto the United States, there were movements and people that promoted that kind of ideology for a good long time. It could go all the way back to the Ku Klux Klan and Lindbergh and American First. I mean, we have a long history of that kind of politics in this country. So, what do we do when we can see that kind of continuity? So, on the one hand, the logical conclusion of many settler colonial movements, of which Zionism is one in that category, is elimination of the native peoples. That's more or less what happened in North America, the United States and Canada, more or less what happened in Australia. But then it didn't happen in South Africa. It didn't happen in Algeria. Why? Because the settlers needed the labor of the local peoples who they conquered, and therefore imposed all manner of brutal circumstances and racist regulations and laws and so on, but didn't commit a genocide. Israel is somewhere in the middle between, let's say, Algeria and North America, in part because the Zionist movement was very weak and couldn't do those things before 1948. It could buy a plot of land from an absentee landlord, evict the Palestinian tenant farmers, but it couldn't mow them down, which is what happened in places like Algeria and even South Africa when we're talking about the Afrikaners and the Great Trek and so on. So again, it's important to remember, if we're going to do the long historical trajectory, that Israel was a project of the global left. And so even though there was this settler colonial movement, there was also this movement of saving the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, most of whom would have preferred to come to the United States, but we had racist immigration laws and wouldn't let them into the country. So, okay, well, then they could go there, right? Those people who came to Israel at that point weren't seeing themselves as colonial conquerors. They're seeing themselves as we survived with the clothes on our back and barely made it out of hell. So it took a long time to forge a population that imagined itself as, we're Jews and Jews are not murderers, the Nazis are murderers and we're good people and we just want to be here, and Palestinians, we don't want to think about that too much. And actually, some of us are good friends with the Palestinians, but okay, it was very complicated at first to sort things out, and there was a lot of opposition. Israel imposed a military government on Palestinian citizens long between 1949 and 1966. This is before the 1967 war and the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And there was lots of opposition to the military government, not only from the left, which would be obvious, but even Begin, the right-wing standard bearer, was opposed to the military government because didn't think that a state should do that to people who were its citizens, because he was, in that sense, bizarrely a liberal. So it took a long time before the Israeli Jewish population was remade through the experience of expanding the settler colonial project into the West Bank, into the Gaza Strip too, except that was pulled back in 2005. And the expansion of the frontier of settlement, of course, always entails more violence, which radicalizes the settler population, and then come and inject this religious messianic sentiment, which is represented by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but which has become much more popular in Israel today. And people saying, well, yeah, we can drive them out of the Gaza Strip altogether because it's a commandment that we should settle the land, and that has to happen before the Messiah comes. And yeah, we should blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock because it's where the temple was, and the Messiah is going to come and we're going to rebuild the temple. So these kind of crazy ideas, which used to be way, way on the margin, are now closer to the center in Israel. And I think that process conforms to the trajectory of settler colonial projects that aren't halted by some liberal process. So today, after most Native Americans have in fact been eliminated, we aren't going to see mass murder of Native Americans. We're going to have some kind of liberal political process which is going to try to deal with them, which in the liberal frame will be by definition inadequate and insufficient. And at the same time, more fundamental claims for land back and reparations and all sorts of things which are emerging. So it's possible for a society to recover from settler colonialism. Not easy, but possible. And so I'm more optimistic than you, Hilton, which might be a first. I don't know.
Please give a warm thank you to Joel Beinin.
Thank you very much.